Today's quick session is going to be a snapshot into Africa Bridging the Gulf. It rides on the season of Africa events. I think we kick-started by us in Dubai last month, followed through by the African heads of state. And our aim today is basically to continue on that and provide those of you who have clients working in Africa, interested in Africa, or indeed in the Gulf and the GCC region, to provide you with some information. I'll hand over to my colleague, Mr. Atiq Anjarwalla, who's the co-founder of the African Legal Network. It's an independent pan-African network on the ground in Africa, run by Africans, most importantly, consisting of more than 700 lawyers. Mr. Kaviraj Singh, could we have some order? Right, I'll hand over to my colleague, Mr. Atiq Anjarwalla.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Atiq Anjarwalla, as Sunita has introduced me. I am the managing partner and founder of ALN Africa Legal Network. You might wonder what an Indian is doing in Africa. So, but I guess many of you know that there was an exodus in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and our family was part of that group that went from Gujarat to East Africa. So I'm a fourth generation Kenyan, proudly Indian, but sadly to say, firstly proudly Kenyan, because that is now my home. We have firms in 13 countries across Africa, and I currently head up our Dubai office, again managing investment going into Africa from Dubai. I've just put a couple of slides up there. Just I know we're mainly lawyers here, but just to give some sort of idea of actually what's happening in the continent. Many of the large Indian groups, large and medium-sized groups, have already witnessed this growth, and in fact, we are fortunate enough to be acting for quite a few of them in connection with their, Africa strategy. So, just giving you some sort of idea of what's happening in terms of growth, and you'll notice that many of the African countries now are sort of leading in terms of GDP. And therefore investment. Again, in terms of FDI, very major FDI coming in. This is from Western Europe, from China, and also from India. And FDI is because of the opportunities people are witnessing, where we're seeing particularly a lot of Indian investment. In terms of the GCC and Dubai, again, a lot of the Indian investment comes through Dubai. You'll be aware that a lot of your Indian groups actually have head offices for Africa in Dubai. And, the GCC has created an amazing enabling environment in terms of infrastructure, telecommunications, etc., which basically allows for substantial investment to go from that region into Africa. This is why we opened the office there, and again, we're acting for a number of Indian clients who have their treasuries and who have their basically sales offices in Dubai, in other GCC countries as well, but mainly in Dubai, helping them to move their investments across onto the continent. So a lot of people ask me, what is happening? Why is Africa such a hot investment destination? And I've given you some of the background, but I thought what would be important is, because we're mainly lawyers here, when you're advising clients, what tends to happen is people tend to view the whole continent as one. And actually, that's very dangerous, because it's actually for 54 different countries. And historically, a bit like India, when we had British, ruling India, we've had a number of different particularly European countries ruling Africa. Where the result is that even from the legal system perspective, we have a number of different legal systems that apply. Portuguese, French, Belgian, Italian, Dutch, German, and some countries, of course, even have a Muslim law. I think the other thing that people don't seem to appreciate, investors as well, is that actually a lot of these countries have quite well-developed legal systems, especially those with a French and British history. So if you take East Africa, they're all actually British colonies, and the legal systems. And so if you took an Indian lawyer who was working there, in terms of his ability to work, it wouldn't actually be that complicated. It wouldn't take that long to adjust, because our Companies Act is the UK Companies Act, Bankruptcy Act is the UK Bankruptcy Act. So a lot of the laws are actually very similar. In fact, until about a year and a half ago, most of Kenya's land law was based on the Indian Transfer Property Act. Again, brought from India at the time when the British came in. So we used to buy our law books from India, in terms of our research. There's been, as I said, a number of reasons why investment has improved. But, in terms of what lawyers need to look at, we certainly are seeing, the recognition of property rights, very important. And again, a lot of the African countries having realized through the bad period of the 80s and 90s that investment simply would not come unless property rights were respected. So you're now finding a lot of laws being enacted to actually guarantee those rights. There are also a number of very interesting trade treaty organizations on the continent, so which allow for example, free movement of goods, free movement of labor. And so what is happening is that, if you set up in one of the countries, then your goods can move around in the different trading zones fairly easily. I think for lawyers who are entering the market, again, bearing in mind that this is a particular legal conference, there are a number of challenges that clients need to be aware of. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there is a general assumption that these markets are not that well developed, but actually that's a mistake. They're actually very well developed. And if you don't plan your investment at the beginning well, then of course you can get caught up quite badly. So pretty sophisticated tax laws in most of the countries. In fact, in a number of East African countries, the tax departments are sent to India for training. So we actually have a lot of our tax inspectors who are actually trained by the tax agencies in India. And a lot of the different taxes that you will see listed up there, I presume would apply for FDI coming into India, and those similar laws apply in many of the African countries. We've also had, in terms of withholding taxes, I've said taxation at offshore level. Now, this has become a very hot topic in Africa now, in light of particularly large capital-intensive investments that is made. And in fact, this became a particularly big issue about 5 or 6 years ago when Bharti bought out Zain. It was about 12, 13 billion, I apologize, dollar investment, buying out all the African telecom operators in about 14 countries of Zain, which was a big Kuwaiti telecom operator. And essentially the deal happened offshore. So they were all offshore companies, and all the countries realized that actually in terms of capital gains, which was substantial for the seller, they got no tax benefit. So a lot of countries have now amended their tax laws, basically taxing any change in economic interest, even though the change of ownership may not happen in country. If there's a change of economic interest, then you'll be taxed. Mauritius, which I know has very favorable double tax treaties with India, also has a very big treaty network with Africa. And so we are seeing a lot of Indian investment actually coming through Mauritius, because it becomes very tax efficient in terms of using those treaties. So withholding tax on interest, withholding tax on dividends, withholding tax on royalty payments. Again, there's an interesting fiscal play with those to try and reduce your incidence of tax. Again, we had an interesting session here on antitrust this morning. Again, a lot of people tend to forget that, as I said earlier, that these countries have actually developed quite well legally. And so there are a lot of antitrust, many countries now have actually quite well-developed antitrust laws. And in some of the countries, they're actually treaty-based. So if you take COMESA, which is about 19 African countries, once you do a cross-border deal across any of those any two member states within COMESA, there is not only the local antitrust body that you need to be involved with, but also at COMESA level. environmental law is actually very well developed in a number of the countries. And like we're finding, I guess, with India, you have to take particular recognition of those. Overall, in terms of exchange controls, I would say the majority of the countries have now liberalized. So if you look at most of the East African countries, unlike India, which I know there's still a lot of restrictions on FDI and foreign ownership, except for certain industries like banking, insurance, telecom, where they have minority local ownership. That's important, minority, not majority local ownership rules. Actually, for 100% foreign ownership generally is allowed. And repatriation based on exchange controls, again, generally allowed. So it's a fairly, overall, a fairly liberal market for doing business. This is you now.
Yeah. Okay. From an Indian perspective, of course, pre-2008, there were many eyebrows raised in relation to Indian companies setting up in Dubai during the real estate boom, and there were many adverse and somewhat negative and questionable connotations attached to a company that wanted to set up in Dubai. Things have come round full circle, which is one of the reasons why you will now see, without a doubt, a greater increase in trade activity and companies who are now looking to set up in Dubai or in some of the other Emirates in the free zones and use those as strategic gateways and hubs for branching out further afield, whether it's bridging continents from Asia to Europe or Asia to Africa, or within the greater GCC region as well. Strategically located, everyone knows that, fantastic infrastructure. Interestingly enough, a huge talent pool throughout many professional sectors of international, which of course brings up, keeps everyone on their toes and ups the game. The competition is healthy. Competitive cost structures for incorporation, setting up, logistics, connectivity. So all the overheads that clients would be very conscious about when looking to expand into a foreign region. A conducive fiscal system, of course, which we all know. At this point in time, of course, a tax-free jurisdiction. There have been certainly discussions, and the rumor mill is rather active in relation to potential introduction of taxes for corporations and VAT. And certainly, as we've said, it all in all basically makes for a gateway for international investment and for trading. We've called Dubai as a game changer again because picking up from where perhaps they've learnt with the benefit of hindsight, Dubai is currently home to the largest free zone in the world, the Jebel Ali Free Zone area, which is extremely active and has its own constitution, tribunals, and sets of laws. Certainly pioneered the free zone as such throughout the world, looking at institutions like DP World, which are doing some fantastic things globally. And most importantly, I think for those of you who may be interested in the judicial system, it's not just a judicial system that is based on Sharia law, i.e. the main onshore Dubai courts. We do have the benefit of if necessary, reaching out to the DIFC courts, which is the Dubai International Financial Center. In itself, a free zone, allowing great freedom of trade, with its own DIFC court system, which is based very importantly on English common law. So from an Indian practitioner's perspective, certainly very easy to navigate around. We've also got, again, very interestingly, something that isn't very well known or certainly not very well publicized, the DIFC LCIA. So you've all heard of SIAC, of course. The LCIA here in India, unfortunately, similarly, is not very well used. The connectivity and the proximity to Dubai and the fact that an LCIA type tribunal is there and available, I think, is something that we need to work more on in educating our clients about. So basically, it's not necessary to jump on a plane to Singapore or to Paris or to London. You can indeed go across 2.5 hours and you're there with equally cost-effective solution for your clients. Of course, the India advantage, as you can see, The facts speak for themselves, trade volumes. Interestingly enough, Dubai is now known as the fifth city of India. Extremely conducive and convivial trade relations between the two, and of course the Indian community is the largest of the expat community in Dubai. I'm not sure how many of you are aware, ordinarily one was previously subjected to forced rules of heirship in relation to devolution of assets and estates. Very recently, the DIFC courts under Sheikh Mohammed's vision has introduced a very interesting protective measure, which is that in relation to the new wills and probate registry, and that is that all non-Muslims owning assets or businesses in Dubai are now no longer subject to Sharia law. So the concept of Sharia law, so hence devolution of your assets and distribution of your estate can be done freely, and you have a free opt-out of Sharia law, which is extremely important to building investor confidence, especially for those like us who reside there, have children there, have assets there, and previously were quite frightened about picking up assets because we never knew what would happen in the event of one of our demises. So tremendous investor protective measures taken place. Just a quick list, those of you who are not aware of all the Indian companies that are there extremely successfully trading using the UAE as a gateway. We work with most of them, and it's an extremely easy system to navigate. Now, leading on from Atiq's presentation in relation to the UAE and to Africa, and for example, advising Indian shareholders or Indian corporates who wanted to then use the UAE as a trading hub for Africa. A quick snapshot, an example of a structure for you, a very simplistic one for this point, for the point of the presentation. You would set up ordinarily your Indian shareholder in India, who would then enter into the UAE through preferably a free zone holding company, which allows you 100% foreign ownership and therefore avoids the need for having any local Emirati shareholding, which previously was for onshore companies fixed at 51%. The UAE company would then invest, for this point we've taken Kenya as an example to show how you can actually advise your clients. And of course monies would flow through from the UAE into Kenya in the form of debt and equity. Now ordinarily, if you actually directly went into trade relations and set up operations in Africa without, Kenya in this example, without using the UAE, your withholding tax certainly would be at a base rate of 10%. Now, due to the fact that Kenya and the UAE have a double taxation agreement, the rate is therefore immediately reduced to 5%. Similarly, interest rates are taxable by non-residents at 15%. Taking advantage of the double tax agreements and structuring yourself through the UAE will reduce that again straight away to 10. Likewise on savings, 5% withholding tax savings and 5% withholding tax savings on interest payments and dividends. And thereafter, of course, once you've repatriated your profits into the UAE, having minimized your taxation point, further repatriation back to the parent company is, of course, tax-free. For those of you who are looking at trading with various African nations, which we often get approached for, especially from some of the larger Indian companies, Mahindra being a classic example. We recently were asked to advise on a 16 Pan-African country rollout. Works very well because people choose to project manage with one set of advisors based in Dubai. And I should add that we have made a deliberate point of employing 2 to 3 absolutely fantastic Indian qualified young bright corporate lawyers, which also gives the client comfort because one is aware of the cultural nuances and communication issues. So again, here, for example, we've taken an Indian shareholding company setting up in the holding, setting up the holding company in a free zone. And here what we do is we have certain other countries, for example, Mozambique, Sudan, Mauritius. No particular reason for choosing this, but just to highlight that one can actually maximize your profitability by structuring with those countries that have the most advantageous double taxation treaties in place. Through the UAE, of course, with Mozambique being again a historic and currently as well a very hot investment destination for Indian companies, there is 0% withholding tax on interest and dividend payments. Mauritius, for example, doesn't have the same, and so therefore going straight through to Mauritius and then thereafter to South Africa and Rwanda, again, provides your client with a great taxation advantage. We talked about, and again in reference to a lot of the companies that have been here today, and with reference to the panels that we've heard today, intellectual property data protection is of course always becoming more and more topical. The ownership of intellectual property as companies roll out into the continent become more and more relevant from the generation of income in the form of royalties. Now, ordinarily, royalties payable by a Kenyan entity to a non-resident would be taxed with a withholding tax of 20%. Now, thanks to the double taxation treaty that exists between Kenya and the UAE, this is again immediately reduced to 10%. So you've made an immediate saving for your client. The onward payments again would be completely tax-free from the UAE, repatriating the proceeds to India. And that's how we would generally always advise clients to structure and ring-fence the IP and therefore protect the royalties and the taxation attached to those royalties in a cost-efficient and commercial environment. I think we've been running grossly behind time today, so in the interest of keeping to the schedule, that's a snapshot of Africa and the Gulf. Are there any questions? Do you want me to run through it again? Any of you from a practitioner's perspective, do you have any questions in regards to Africa perhaps? I mean, there's been a lot of topical interest from a government level, from a state level. We last month hosted a conference, again using the same theme, which is a theme that we coined, Bridging the Gulf. And we had 650 international delegates flying in as far and wide as from New Zealand, Fiji, Hawaii, Bahamas, India, of course. Most of the law firms attended, and from Europe, talking on a range of topics. So there is indeed great synergy. I think there's great trade relations already going, using the companies I just cited as examples. But also I think from a manufacturing perspective, from healthcare, from pharmaceuticals, infrastructure, of course, tremendous trade opportunities. So if any of you do indeed want to quiz us further outside of the forum, we'd be more than happy to do that. And the aim is ultimately to set up a legal platform and a know-how sharing structure, perhaps encouraging secondees between India and Africa, using the Africa Legal Network and using INBA. It's worked very successfully in the past, and we, as I said, we've got offices right down from South Africa all the way up to Nigeria. So that's Africa Bridging the Gulf. I think the gentleman you wanted to... Do they have an IP system at all in Africa? Which country in particular? There's 54. Yeah. Yeah. The IP systems in Africa, again, as I was talking about IP, which is a very, very hot and relevant concern for clients. Of course, there are various trade groupings in the economic sectors. You have fast-track application processes. The Nice Convention and the Madrid Protocol are recognized and fully enforceable. Right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sunita. And we are always looking forward to new things. We had an African summit last month of 54 African countries in India. So we are looking forward to the results of those summits.
When I heard that the subject of Africa was on the agenda, I rushed back in because there are few more important areas of the world today, few more areas where there is so much to be won, so much to be done, and so little to be understood than the great, mysterious continent of Africa. Never forget, it was the Romans who said everything originally comes out of Africa. But for this group of people here today, there is so much we can learn. And how many of you are aware of the biggest economic change that's taking place in the continent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa today? Because it is, without a doubt, and those of you who've read Philip French's book that was published last year, Africa, China's Other Continent, will realize that there is a massive Chinese economic expansion program throughout the whole of Africa. If you went today to Maputo in Mozambique, if you went to Senegal, if you went to Namibia, you would see everywhere there Chinese embassies, Chinese trading missions, Chinese traders, because there's a gigantic Chinese move. In some embassies in Windhoek, there are 2,000 accredited diplomats at the Chinese embassy. In Senegal, there are 3,500 Chinese cultural attachés and commercial attachés. Now, why is this important to an Indian audience? I tell you, the contribution of people from Indian subcontinent to development of East Africa is absolutely massive. And now, those of you who remember 1968 when most East African nations were expelled from Tanzania, and 1973 when the horrendous, foul regime of Idi Amin threw so many people out of Uganda, many of them, who I'm glad to say, came to Ealing in West London, where the Patels invigorated our part of the world, where the Gujaratis, and you may not know Gujaratis here, but that infusion of Gujarati culture and hard work and intelligence, they came to our part of the world in London. They also went to Leicester, but that's because they got lost on the way to Ealing, but they made Leicester a wonderful place, and they made Ealing bloom. And my good friend Virendra Kumar Sharma, he and I, both honorary Patels, we both respect and admire. I have a Kachi Puggery at home. I am a great admirer. But Africa nowadays is seeing a return. The Madhvanis are back. The Gujaratis are coming back. People from the rest of India are coming back. And what is different now? What is so wonderful about the new India? Let me tell you, my friends, when people from particularly from Gujarat, but many other states, from Punjab in particular, when they went to East Africa, they went there as indentured labourers under the old British Empire system. My friends, that's people's grandparents, great-grandparents, built the railways, built the harbours, built the schools, built the infrastructure, and they performed so brilliantly that they managed to actually have a reputation for efficiency and achievement. The British didn't understand that, didn't appreciate it. However, Idi Amin didn't either, because he was jealous. However, now that wheel has turned, and how symbolically that the great symbol of Hinduism, that wheel of turning, has now turned and is now visible throughout the continent of Africa. So what I say to you is, I have nothing personally against the Chinese. The Chinese may do what they will. Let them get on with it. But let them not be the lead nation when it comes to exploiting, and not necessarily exploiting, but bringing forth and working with the people of Africa. That vast mineral wealth that exists. What we need is the gentle philosophical combination of hard work and ideology that characterizes the Indian people, that ethics and ambition married together to achieve greatness. That is the future. The world needs India. Africa especially needs India. Thank you.
May I call upon Mr. Axel Hack to please facilitate our speaker and the moderator. Ms. Sunita Singh-Dalal and Mr. Atiq Anjarwalla. And one more for Mr. Atiq.
Oh, me too.
Yeah.
Why don't you take on the Africa one? Is that the next one?